Ladies and gentlemen, I am here with Dan Koch of the Depolarize podcast. And Dan, thank you so much for being on Transcending Politics in what I believe will be our debut interview from
Oh,
the show.
wow. Belle of the ball.
Well,
Thank you, John.
that's a lot of pressure to put on you. So but I figured your shoulders were broad enough to handle it. So
Well, it'll be all up or downhill from here, depending on how you like to use that phrase.
well, okay. No, I've got high expectations, absolutely. But Dan, well, in all seriousness, I do appreciate you being willing to spend a little time with me here today. And I wanted to talk to you, particularly because I think that you occupy an interesting place in the zone of public conversation. It's a space that I am engaged in as well, both through my work with Better Angels and as a commentator and a person who wishes to sort of transcend the traditional divide in American politics and culture and so forth. Um, I think that part of what I'd like to start off asking you about is how exactly um, how exactly did you come to the point to where your mission in terms of analyzing politics and culture is one that focuses on bridging divides rather than accentuating them or rather than emphasizing them?
Yeah, good question. I think that what happened for me before I started Depolarize, I had been for maybe a couple years trying to ask like hard questions on Facebook, just my own Facebook feed. I had I don't know, a little over 1,000 friends because of time I spent in a band. And I would just ask these questions, or I would sort of try and get the temperature of the room on some particular political question or theological question or social question. And then what I found myself sort of organically doing was moderating those conversations. So I would be like, okay, Jim, that's a little like, that seems like a bad argument. Are you saying this? Or, all right, Lisa, let's hang on. Jim's not saying that. And it kind of in this mediator role.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that led to, so that's going on in the background. And then, of course, everything ramps up with the 2016 election. And the sort of the polarization had become evident basically to everybody paying attention. And it was at that point that I thought, okay, this is interesting. So there's something going on here where people either can't see or hear each other, or like, why is it that people cannot conceive of the point of view of the other person?
Mm.
And
Right.
then that's the sort of phenomenon that I became interested in. And then I think once you become interested in that and you start looking into it, for instance, a big book for me is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, C.S. Lewis talked about it. I mean, a lot of people talked about it. This kind of inability. I mean, Haidt would say that Aristotle talked about it. But once you start looking at that, well, then that becomes the interesting thing. So now you're talking about the human mind.
Right.
And once you start talking about the human mind, I mean, the other stuff that is more political in nature seems boring. And so when it was time to do the show, I'm just like, this will be the focus. I'll try and figure out, why are we this way? And I don't know. I found the phenomenon of polarization and the phenomenon of people being so unable to even understand each other as the most interesting thing about politics and about the whole 2016 cycle. And so that's what I started working on.
Now, obviously, well, it seems obvious to say that some of the most divisive figures in American politics, on the right as well as on the left, I think, depending on where you look, are people who are possessed of, no pun intended, but people who are possessed of religious faith, right? And even Christian faith. And one thing that's always struck me is just the endless capacity that people have, that we have for different interpretations of scripture. including interpretations that allow us to sort of de-emphasize the role that understanding and sort of placing yourself in the shoes of your neighbor or even of your enemy has in terms of allowing us to sort of message the gospel or otherwise live a more Christ-like way of being. In your case, I see that your political sort of mission, for lack of a better way of putting it, is what it is. But I have to imagine that that is also connected with some theological or spiritual perspective on your part. Now, I've listened to your show a certain amount now, and I definitely get a certain tone or vibe from you in on a religious level. But I would be interested to just sort of hear you articulate how it is, if there is any particular connection, how it is any sort of theological or religious or spiritual perspective that you have ties into the way you approach these political and cultural conversations.
Oh yeah, it's definitely related. So I'm a Christian, and I'm kind of a man between denominations. I attend a Presbyterian church with my wife, but I also attend Catholic Mass fairly regularly. And if I were to list out all the things I believe about God, someone might think I was Eastern Orthodox.
Oh, really?
I've sort of float around. I've toyed around with getting a master's of theology for many years, and I maybe will do that one day. So I'm very interested in that world. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," but I feel like that's more of a secondary motivation for me. I think that I'm glad that I'm trying to be a peacemaker, and that accords with the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
But I think it's more something like this. In 1932, 99% of Germany was Christian, and the other 1% was Jewish. Right. Whatever it meant to be Christian in Germany in 1932 is not enough, right? Like, that was not sufficient to have a basically 100% Christian country, was not sufficient enough to stop Hitler. And I just kind of think, okay, so to the extent that what I mean by Christian and what a 1932 German person meant by Christian, if those are the same, then that's not good enough. That's not going to be, that's not going to cut it. I want to be the kind of person who would have resisted Hitler, would have resisted Stalin, whatever. Pick your dark time in history. And so I'm more interested. So I'm interested in depolarization mostly in that it gets to the truth of the human experience. It gets to the truth of human psychology. I'm interested in the othering aspect of political rhetoric and how that really seems to not line up with the Bible. You talked about how, well, we could talk about sort of the left and the right and how they use religion in politics, and that's interesting. You can ask me follow-ups if you want, but I'll just end my answer with that. That's where I'm kind of going in my life and with the show is like, so you want to be the kind of person who would have resisted Hitler. Okay, you're probably not going to have to resist Hitler in your life or an equivalent of it. Just statistically, it's unlikely. But if you want to be that kind of a person, how do you do that? Well, you can't do what everyone around you is just doing, because that doesn't work well. And that is related to faith for me. I mean, that's Jesus says the road is narrow that leads to life, and the road is wide that leads to destruction. And I don't think he's just talking about heaven and hell, or maybe even talking about heaven and hell at all. Saying. So I think about that a lot.
Well, I love the way that you phrase the quintessential sort of objective there as a Christian, and perhaps just for being a moral person, in general, which is to say that you want to be the type of person who would have resisted Hitler. And it's funny, I don't know if you have any particular opinion on Jordan Peterson, although if you do, I'd be fascinated to hear it. But I frequently hear him say something similar, but a bit inverted, which is that
he says you wouldn't have.
Right. Yeah. And yet most people sort of assume that naturally they would have been one of the heroes of that time, which, as a little aside, is sort of part of what aggravates me about the tendency people have to sort of judge human beings from past periods of time, because we have this tendency to look back on people who were, I mean, whatever the case may be, slaveholders, killers, corrupt individuals, and people who made mistakes in one area or another, according to our modern moral matrix, as opposed to sort of judging people by the context of their times. Because I'm sure, hopefully 100 years from now, people will look back at this podcast and listen to Dan Koch and John Wood and say, man, those guys were really confused about some issues. We've sure gotten a lot better since those dark days.
Yeah, we would hope so, right? Yeah. Well, so that brings up something that I actually really do love about just a generally speaking, a Christian perspective or a Jesus-centered perspective, which is this concept of judge not lest you be judged.
Right.
And, it's interesting. Jesus says, because to the extent that you judge, you will be judged by the same measure. And I'm just kind of riffing here, but we might want to think, well, sure, I'll judge Thomas Jefferson by the same measure. I wouldn't have done that. But if he lived 250 years ago, then whatever that same measure is for you today,
right,
or is something probably more like, are you polluting the environment? Do you drive a car?
There's some equivalent, whether we know exactly.
We don't know what it is. Right.
And
so the same measure is. I like that to go. Yeah, I mean, most people are not morally heroic, and if the point of life is just to be comfortable, well, then you don't have to listen to the show and whatever. Godspeed. But if the point of life is to be really good and loving, well, let's get to it.
And that is it's something I think about, particularly in the Christian context. I think that we're all faced with moral questions across the course of our lives, really every day. And one thing that I appreciate about a Christian perspective, and in particular the idea of trying to sort of abstain from sin, and there are larger conversations we could get into about what sin is that we probably won't have time to go
beyond the scope of today's discussion, maybe. But
one thing I'll generally say about it is that my sense has always been that there's sin living a life that allows you to sort of avoid sin as much as you can, to make that your objective, is sort of a different methodological approach on a psychological level than saying, okay, let me go out and do good. It's different. It's one thing to say, let me go out and do good in the world. And it's another thing to say, let me go out and avoid doing harm. And really, the Apostle Paul defines love as doing no harm to a neighbor, right? Or rather says that love does no harm to a neighbor, and therefore love is the fulfillment of the law. And it gets to this idea of kind of remaining pure in a sense. Now, I don't want to get too abstract about it, but to tie it into this political sort of environment that we're in, well before I became a Christian, and I can give you a little background on that transition if you like, but well before I became a Christian, my hero as a young adolescent and a budding student of American history and African American history in particular was Dr. / Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And one thing that always struck me about him was that he spoke in these transcendent moral terms, focusing on the transformational power of love to redeem people who are sort of possessed by a spirit of error, possessed by anger, possessed by bigotry or racism, whatever the case may be. And I long felt that Dr. King could not have been quite so effective in changing the hearts of Americans, black and white, by the way. I mean, King, spent a great deal of time, reaching out to people, white people of prejudiced perspectives, but also trying to soften the hearts of black people who had become jaded by an oppressive history. He couldn't have done that if he did not, I believe, have an internal dialogue that allowed him to consistently think in terms of goodwill and compassion for his political opponent. And so, I got that sense from Dr. King early on, and I, uh, I came to think that that was something that was unique to his teaching. I didn't have a framework for it until I engaged the Bible in a close kind of way, because it's funny, people interpret the God of the Bible as sort of ushering in arbitrary commandments and so forth. But the idea of being holy means that this sort of speak no evil, hear no evil sort of thing. I mean, that's become a cliche in our culture, but you keep yourself pure from feeling personally antagonistic towards those with whom you have differences. So I'm struck by a sort of type of Christian culture, one that's, generally right-wing politically, but it exists on the left as well, that says that in order for us to advance a Christian agenda religiously, we have to advance a contentious agenda politically, not just in terms of advancing policies that might be controversial. Controversy is not a bad thing, really. I mean, if you're standing up for something, you're controversial, no matter what it is. But that we so willingly as Christians engage one another in a way to where we define each other as the enemy. I just wonder, how does that phenomenon, why does that not seem more glaringly sort of self-contradictory in the eyes of many Christians in your experience? And maybe that might be a big question, but I'm sure you have some thoughts. Yeah.
That is a very big question. I'll reframe it and make sure I'm answering what you mean to ask.
Sure.
Why is it that the politically right Christian sort of superstructure, why do they seem so comfortable with political and rhetorical tactics that make the other side just demonize them, something like that?
Well, that's absolutely right.
Okay. Well, okay. So, I mean, I think that people just do this. I just think that everybody demonizes the other side by default. So, I mean, I think that there's, you read a lot of pieces that are more from a leftward perspective of like, just can't wait for all these baby boomers to die so that we can finally get some sensible policies in place. And, I think that's not that different. I mean, it's reducing them to a population of voters who are getting in the way of progress rather than a bunch of people to be dealt with respectfully. So, I mean, I just think it's, what you might hope and what I would hope is that particularly religiously motivated and especially motivated by Christianity, leaders like that would be really keen to not demonize the other, because it's in the Gospels just so thoroughly.
Yeah.
The Good Samaritan, is a religious and ethnic outsider who's the hero of that parable. The women are the first witnesses of the resurrection in the gospel accounts. There's just, whatever. It's there's so many that it's silly to list them.
Yeah. Well, even in Jude, I mean, he remarks that the angels of heaven don't revile Satan himself, right? There's this idea that foul speech shall not be shall not be spoken among the saints. I mean, it seems like there's sort of a rhetorical standard that's laid out in the Gospels that we just shoot right past.
Well, if you want to ask, it's not the only one, right? I mean, Greg Tanelshoff, who's a professor at Biola, he's a philosophy professor, has a great little book called I Told Me So, Self-Deception in the Christian Life. And he says, you go to a mega church, anywhere in America, especially in wealthier areas, and if you were to poll people, hey, has anybody ever broached the topic as to whether or not it might be appropriate to buy a new BMW? and what you'll find is very rarely. There are patterns that groups form around, accepted behaviors. And so, and I grew up in one such church. I grew up in Los Gatos, California. We went to church in Saratoga, which is like on every one of those, 10 best towns to live in America lists, just millionaires and 10 out of 10 schools and a lot of money.
Mm,
And we did not have that much money, but our church, many people at our church did.
mm,
And no one ever talked about the cars they drove and the $4 million houses where we all went and had youth group
mm,
running around in their pools. I mean, nobody brought up if this was a good use of funds
mm,
or a Christian use of funds.
mm,
So, I mean, I think that there's all kinds of stuff in the Bible and in Jesus' teaching that we blow right past as
right.
Christians. And
Mm,
especially the more institutional something becomes. And I'm not anti-institution
mm,
personally, but that's just kind of inevitable.
mm.
So, I mean, it's not a very satisfying answer to your question. I don't know that there's anything particularly interesting about the right that makes them do that. I mean, I think that, let's say the left does a better job of taking the Sermon on the Mount seriously, but the right
Mm.
does a better job of taking sort of holiness seriously. I mean,
Well, the only reason, and to tell you the truth, it wasn't even necessarily my intent to focus on the right in that statement. The
sure.
only reason I would lean towards doing that is just because the cultural right sort of owns the space a little bit more in terms of
Yeah,
Christian politics, right? But I
sure.
mean, I live in and come to some degree from an African American Christian environment where the rhetoric is just as hot in support of more left leaning politics and
Yeah.
so forth. Um,
I mean, if you're asking me, is it blatant hypocrisy for Franklin Graham and James Dobson and Jerry Falwell Jr. to just say the opposite of what they said about Bill Clinton when they're talking about Trump? Yeah,
mm,
it is. It's
yeah.
we don't even have to have a conversation about that.
Mm,
It's so clearly hypocritical.
mm,
Now, if you're going to ask me, is the decision for an evangelical pew sitting Christian to vote for Trump as straightforward as that? No, it's not as
mm,
straightforward as that.
mm,
The only real ire I have is for those leaders
mm,
who are just giving like they don't even think that they have to square themselves with what they've said in the past,
mm,
seemingly at all,
yeah.
and really are essentially state propaganda for the president.
Mm,
I mean, there's no place for that, but
mm,
that's not the average voter.
yeah. Well, it's funny because on a certain fundamental level, I do identify with the basic sort of with the basic sort of imperatives of the Christian right. I mean, I'm a Republican myself.
Yeah,
I don't take party labels very seriously, to be honest. But part of the reason I do register Republican is because of the fact that even if I find myself kind of repelled a little bit by the tone of much of social conservative politics, I nevertheless believe that this country could use a heck of a lot more Jesus, and that I mean, particularly speaking, that the 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 structure of the ideals as put forth in the gospel and the overall sort of Christian canon, when applied to both the life of the individual in particular and to collective existence on the social layer generally, have the effect of transforming people's values in a way that causes us to find meaning for ourselves individually by applying our hearts to the service of mankind generally. And I can't think of any more radically beneficial sort of approach for one to take to serving their country and their community than to be oriented around that type of radical love and radical service. And so, I very much want to see sort of the type of revival that I think periodically in American life is sort of swept through this country and done a lot to elevate the moral conversation. I mean, I think that we can go back to the abolitionist movement and attribute a great deal of the fervor for the end of slavery to the Second Great Awakening. I think that the Azusa
yeah,
Awakening did much to open up the a passion and a capacity for charity and service in urban communities. I think that a big part of the reason Dr. King was successful was, yes, I mean, he is much or more than anybody I can think of oriented his social politics or had his social politics infused by what I would sort of think of as the Holy Spirit, but this Christian idea of self-sacrificial love. But there was also a transformation taking place within the wider Christian community, including in the South with Billy Graham's crusades, and with his evangelical outreach and so forth. I do believe that there's great potential for good that can emerge through the church, including through the institutional church, if it's oriented around the transformative power of love.
Well, no doubt.
But I feel like we have to make a choice between that and the sort of strict adherence to dogma that allows us to take satisfaction in the idea that I'm right and you're wrong, but at the end of the day, we don't solve the problem. So here's an academic question for you, sort of. Given what I've just said about that, I'd be curious to get your sense as to whether or not you see some prospect for there being that type of revival in our current day, whatever it is it may look like. And if you would see that as being, if at the same time you see any value to the perspective of, say, a writer like Rod Dreher. I think I frequently mispronounce his name.
I think it's Dreher.
Rod Dreher, right. Well, I spoke to him briefly at Pepperdine, and I still mispronounce his name. But he's got a perspective which I find is interesting, which says that really what it is the church should look to do in our current day is to not reach out so much, but to sort of consolidate our own sort of Christian communities and so forth, right, and to kind of wade out the storm of the upheaval of broader society by seeing to it that we preserve our own Christian integrity on a more localized sort of level, So, is there value in both of these perspectives? Is there a contradiction? Should we be going forth and evangelizing a better way of politics, or should we be sort of, focused on our own families and just making sure that we do right in our own private lives? What's the balance for a person of faith seeking to do the right thing in today's climate?
There obviously has to be a balance of both. The pitfall, the common pitfall of the right is to ignore systemic injustice and systemic problems and to focus on family and individual piety. And the pitfall of the left is to focus so much on systemic problems that we ignore, or to not feel comfortable making any claims about individual piety or family values or whatever. And I think that whatever the solution is, it's got to be somewhere in between, some combination of the two. I'm no expert on guessing where the next revival might come from.
But not really a fair question.
No, that's fine. No, but I have a couple thoughts about this, and I'm not going to quote him, but I know that Jamar Tisby of the Witness, formerly Reformed African American Network, has criticized the Benedict option, which is Dreher's book.
You spoke to Jamar Tisby on one of your podcasts, correct?
Yes, and he's on some upcoming episodes as well.
Very cool.
He's going to make his way into many of them, and I don't even want to say I'm going to paraphrase him, because I feel like it's a paraphrase of a paraphrase, but something to the effect of, the Benedict option to leave, to sort of focus on insular communities where the faith can grow. It's like this new idea for white Christians, but he says for Black Christians, it's not. I mean, Black Christians have had to sort of do that forever since they got here and became Christians. And that, look, that doesn't mean that there's not really interesting stuff in that book. And I do plan to read that book. And I've heard some really interesting conversations with him. And I read Dreher's stuff fairly frequently. And I love what he has to add to the conversation. But, in thinking about where might a revival come from, I mean, I'm tempted to think that right now, baby boomers on the right are so calcified in conservative capitalist Americanism, or I actually don't want to say, I love capitalism. I want to say conservative consumerist Americanism. That I mean, I've got to think if there's going to be an uprising of spiritual fervor, it's going to come from the left. I mean, I think it'll probably come from the Black church.
Mm.
I mean, think about moral heroes of the last 5 years in America. You know who's at the top of my list? Is the
Who's that?
survivors of Charleston,
Mm.
who the day after, got on camera and said, "Dylan Roof, we forgive you."
Mm. Yeah.
They instantiated the spirit of Dr. King.
Mm-hmm.
And and then we have Pat Robertson saying, "Mr. Trump, you know, you inspire us." And I mean, if I got to pick, if I'm a betting man,
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and I, this is not, I don't want to make
Mm-hmm.
a guess at where it's coming from, but I will just say, in my own life, making this podcast, doing interviews with Christians all across the political spectrum and racial spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and denominational spectrum, which is what I did for this season of Depolarize, I have been most interested in and surprised by, and just kind of, I've chewed on it much longer, my conversations with the African American Christians and Asian American Latina Christians. And I just think that, not that the left always has a beat on it and the right's always wrong, nothing like that, but just right now in 2018, I want to say we should be listening to Christians of color who are coming from, who are looking at the systemic side of things a bit more, and who frankly seem to be taking the words of Jesus more seriously in this moment.
Well, I'd love to be able to put a couple of tags on a couple of the points that you made. First of all, just as a very quick aside on Donald Trump and Christians who voted for Donald Trump, and this is for me to put on the record. You don't have to jump in here after me. But I did not vote for Donald Trump. Part of that was a reflection of conscience for me, and part of it was just a fear of maybe a lack of competence, which doesn't mean that there aren't certain things that have happened since he's been president that he's responsible for that I think he should get positive credit for.
Sure, I would agree.
Yeah. Nevertheless, I divide Christians who voted for Trump into two categories. One I have a fair amount of sympathy for, and another I struggle with a bit more. The first category is people who recognized all of the moral failings and all of the contradictions between his words and his actions and the teachings of Jesus and the substance of the gospel, who nevertheless were operating under the presupposition that at the end of the day, the presidency is a worldly office and certain material political things have to be safeguarded, whether it's the integrity of the Constitution, policy pertaining to abortion, the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And they just felt that, ultimately they had to vote for the candidate who was going to hold the line on these important material issues, while not in any way condoning or seeming to condone his other failings. I can appreciate that perspective. I have a different perspective, which is that ultimately the change you see in society, I think, originates fundamentally with our starting point spiritually and morally, and that we want even our votes to reflect those values, because I feel as if you've got to create the moral foundation from the bottom up, and we can't rely on technical progress to take the place of moral and spiritual progress. But even so, I can understand that. But that second category of pro-Trump Christian voters, I have a more difficult time with. And those are the voters who seem to not only vote for him because they, agreed with his policies, but who even seem to sort of celebrate his approach to conversation and to just, well, like you said, to just, to praise him in spite of things that they vilified, Bill Clinton or other politicians for doing just as much as, in a morally challenged direction. That to me flirts with the line of hypocrisy, whereas the first category of voters do not.
Sure.
Yeah. So that's just my take on that. But in terms of what you said about the Black church possibly being a source of revival, I think that you hit on I think that at the core of what you said is something very real, and that's the fact that in the African American experience, there is this sort of raw and kinetic appreciation of the suffering and the imperative of love and forgiveness as expressed not just in the gospel but in the plight of the Hebrew people and the Israelites across history, because in part because in the Black experience, you know, the memory of slavery is not such an abstract thing. Naturally, I didn't live through slavery. My grandparents didn't live through slavery. But, you know, these cultural memories are passed down in a way to where, you know, African Americans, and certainly historically in this country's history, could read Exodus and see themselves in very literal terms, you know. And the benefits of Christianity were not really tied to the sort of institutionalized access to status and, you know, a sort of worldly kind of social or professional approval, or the trappings of religious office, or the sort of, you know, auxiliary or indirect benefits of being a part of a social institution that also happened to have a moral or spiritual component to it. You know, in the midst of oppression and persecution, you're literally drawing on faith just to survive, you know, just to survive these hardships. Yeah. And Christians of all colors, I think, understand, you know, the power of Christ and the redemptive, you know, properties of the Spirit to allow us to get through hardships. But that knowledge is much more generalized throughout the African American experience, and was very much, I think, the source of Dr. King's philosophy and his mode of approach in the political zone. Now, having said that, I think that there's a bit of a danger in our current time. You know, for me, when I look at elements of the Black Lives Matter movement, however much I may sympathize with certain motivations, you know, behind it and so forth, and elements of particularly the younger sort of activist culture in the African American community, you know, I see. Let me stream it out for you like this, and you can just give me whatever impressions you have. I don't expect you to get too granular on this, but you know, but I see this sort of falling from grace happening, where you have a person like Dr. King and the nonviolent movement setting this remarkable moral standard for the country and the world by doing everything they could to live up to the spirit of Christ in their social actions. And then I see sort of the institutionalization of King's legacy, you know, itself, the civil rights legacy itself, sort of meshed with an institutionalization of Christianity in the Black church, which has led to, I think, the elevation of figures like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, both of whom are reverends, both of whom, you know, I could say have maybe done or said some things that are probably correct and are very charismatic, but both of whom, particularly if you're measuring them up against even a modest kind of evaluation of the gospel sort of commandments for our lives, fall painfully short on a moral level in terms of, you know, the type of leadership that King demonstrated and that I think Scripture calls upon us for. I mean, I don't see them as being radically different from Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson in certain ways. And, you know, I could go deeper into that. I don't think we have to. But because of the fact that I think that there have been sort of a watering down of King's legacy and the Christian mission within the Black church, I think that in part because of that, you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at a lot of the younger Black activists, not as many of them are Christian, really. I mean, sure, obviously there are many who are, but they're coming.
For instance, Ta-Nehisi Coates, his atheism is sort of a central plank of his whole worldview.
Yes. Well, that is the perfect example. In fact, you know, I just recently wrote an article for Ario magazine called The Lost Legacy of Martin Luther King. And, you know, people on the left and right say King's legacy has been lost, but for different reasons. People on the left will say, well, people forget that King was a leftist and who believed in radical redistributionism. And people on the right will say, well, we forget that King was a traditionalist and that he had great admiration for Abraham Lincoln and the founders, and he was a Christian after all, and therefore a social conservative and so forth. But the thing that's really lost to my way of thinking is just the focus on love as this transformative value. So Cornel West, who I find to be very fascinating and who I think has a wonderful moral voice on these sorts of issues, I quoted him in the article as saying, and I'm going to get it wrong here myself, but But to paraphrase, he said that he's as excited as he is about the accomplishments of the younger generation of Black intellectuals and activists. He worries about individuals like Ta-Nehisi Coates, in part because he thinks that they forget that if it were the case that African Americans historically were to have engaged in the kind of directly confrontational and militant sort of activities and attitudes that some people, in the civil rights struggle and even today might advocate for, if we were to be genuinely militant and hostile towards our oppressors, there would have been a civil war every generation of America. There would be no American experiment, and we would have descended into a crypto-fascist authoritarian nation long ago. In other words, if African Americans had produced terrorists instead of Frederick Douglass, instead of Ella Baker, instead of Martin Luther King Jr., if we hadn't wielded the moral force of love and its transformative power, America would have suffered, and we would not have made the progress, speaking in terms of the African American community in particular, that was made by following that higher ideal, which is embodied in the Christian ethic. So, I'm worried that we're losing that focus within the Black community today. As an institution, the Black church is still very much influential. And I still think that the seeds of revival are there. And because I operate on the principle of faith and believing that ultimately God has a reason for all things happening the way they do, I'm not worried about it in a long-term way, but I do think that there's going to have to be some reawakening within the Black church to allow it to achieve the potential that you alluded to a moment ago. Is there anything you'd want to add to that as a person who's been looking at it from the outside a bit more conscientiously than other white folks?
I've been looking at it a bit, but I'm no expert, and it also doesn't even feel like my discussion to have for the most part. I mean,
I shouldn't draw you into it.
No, it's okay. I mean, I don't have much to say about Coates or King and Cornel West. I mean, I do read Coates, and I find him to be an incredibly helpful additional
for sure,
for me to see things through, because his experience has been so different than mine. But I don't know. And I also I'm not, I don't know. I hopefully know my limitations. I'm much more comfortable talking about white evangelicals.
No, that's
what do you think about Dr. Reverend Barber? I mean, do you think that he might be doing something with the Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign? That
it's not something that I know terribly much about. Would you summarize it for me and for my audience?
My understanding, and all I've really done is join the email list.
Right.
So I'm not that far deep, but I believe that Reverend Barber's his basic goal is to take what Martin Luther King Jr. was calling the Poor People's Campaign, which he had started to outline before his death.
Right.
And so it is a combination of kind of these family moral values, equity for the poor, nonviolence, and a peace movement message, maybe an anti-war thing. And I hope I'm not missing another plank of that. I mean, racial reconciliation. And so I don't know, but you could contrast that with, for instance, the Black Lives Matter platform.
Right.
And, I don't know, I'd be curious what you thought between the two of them, but we'd have to do that live on air.
Well, it's something that I'll research, but I don't, I don't have any doubt that there are responses coming from across the board. And, part of what I would like to see, and in part, it's why it makes some sense for me to sort of draw you into this sort of cross-cultural dialogue. And by the way, I think that on your show, for anybody who hasn't listened, I think it's, season 2, you had an episode that I was listening to where you made a point of highlighting the experiences of Christians from across the cultural landscape. And one of the questions that I thought was interesting that you asked them was how they felt about the term evangelical, whether or not they, identified with that term or not. And it was interesting to hear people basically describe themselves theologically as evangelical, but still shy away from the term and so forth.
Yeah, one of our voters, Justin Gibney, who's also a campaign strategist, and he co-hosts the Church Politics podcast. I have the tape of it. I haven't aired it yet. I'm not sure if I will, but I literally read him the Lifeway Research 4-point
Yeah.
rubric. And after everyone, he's like, totally.
Yeah, right.
He's like, but I don't call myself an evangelical.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that is where I get really interested. I go, oh, okay, so something's going on here.
Yeah. Well, it seems to demonstrate the fact that something is fundamentally askew in the Christian conversation, right? Because it seems to me like there has to be bridges to cross upon the most foundational truths of the gospel, which, I mean, just like in politics, I think it's a direct sort of parallel, allows us to remain in productive disagreement on all sorts of theological details while still being able to hold hands on the most important question. This idea of course, loving your neighbor as you love yourself and loving your enemy as you love yourself. I mean, I think in terms of our conduct in the world and our treatment of one another, that's where it has to begin, right? I mean, I just don't see what could be more foundational than that.
So there are two things here. One thing is that it's obviously the message of the gospel to have that kind of unity. But then the other point is that actually unity requires great courage. So I'm reading a book called The Myth of Certainty by Daniel Taylor right now. I think it's from the 90s. He used to teach at Bethel University in Twin Cities, Minnesota. And he draws a distinction between unity and what was it? Uniformity, I think. So uniformity is cheap. And you get uniformity by enforcing really strict boundaries. And uniformity is outward. It's about outward action. Uniformity is essentially legalistic. And uniformity is actually pretty easy. Like if you want to go join a cult and stay in the cult, it's not that hard. As long as you're willing to not have a person, you're as long as you're willing to be under someone else's entire rubric your whole life, all you gotta do is follow the rules. And that group will be completely uniform. Unity is much harder. Unity is inward. It's not outward. And unity means that we are in communication. We are in community while we disagree. And so if you think of it that way, well, then it isn't surprising that the church does not have all that much unity because people are not that good. The fundamental teaching of Christianity is like we're pretty messed up. Like we're not good at this stuff, right? And so you'd think that what is it? Unity in essentials and charity and everything else. That's the most straightforwardly Christian claim, and yet we're human beings, and so it's unlikely to be really instantiated in the world to a great degree.
Well, I mean, you make an important point, of course, which is that as backwards and hypocritical as so many things tend to seem to be in the church and so forth, it's actually exactly the way it's supposed to be, or exactly the way the Bible would have you expect it to be, precisely because as you, and this is really where we started the conversation, it requires true courage and true character to begin to live up to these standards. I mean, Jesus sets a very high bar. Let's be honest.
It's an impossible bar, really. Yeah,
it's an impossible bar, right? And that's
perfect, just as your Father is perfect.
And precisely. And the advantage in that, of course, is that you'll never hit it, but in continually striving after it, there's no limit to the progress that you can make.
You never run out of runway.
Yeah. Exactly. And that's actually the good news. That's not the bad news. That's the good news, because as bad as the moment may seem to be, or as far short as you seem to fall in the moment, as good as you could truly imagine yourself actually becoming, you could become better than that, even if your faith is true enough and if you're dedicated enough to progressing. Because I feel that the better we become and the more acquainted we become with the fullness and depth and dimensions of Christ, the more we see how much road still lies ahead of us. And
I mean, Socrates said, the more I learn, the more I know how little I know. And that I think that totally applies to the spiritual life as well.
Right. I do think that there's something transformational in the in the Christian ethic, which is accessible to people who don't believe. And clearly, Dr. King believed that as well. And one thing King said frequently in his writings and speeches was that, naturally he was a person who believed that the moral arc of the universe was long but bent towards justice, and he meant that in literal terms. He believed that God was ushering us towards a beloved community, but he also was quick to point out the fact that there were people who were a part of the civil rights movement, a part of the nonviolent movement, who were not believers, but who still recognized the power and value of love as a transformational force. And so, part of what I want to see is, yes, I want to see this ethic and this spiritual vigor surrounding the idea that love is a proactive power and not just sort of a passive affection. I would love to see for that spirit, blossom in the church again and usher itself forward like a raging river into the social life of Christian America. But I would also like to see that spirit, sweep through secular America, regardless of whether or not people come around to, a biblical worldview in strict theological terms, And so, I wonder your feeling about the prospect of that sort of conversation, because interestingly, and I feel like God has a reason for this, and I feel like there's sociological reasons for this and psychological reasons for this that can be pointed to. But you said it yourself. I mean, there, folks on the left tend oftentimes to be more sort of engaged with the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and contemplating the implications of those teachings than are many folks on the right. And so, adopting love as a proactive social force of social transformation and bringing the secular side of America into dialogue with the Christian side of America around that, that central conviction. Do you think that there's a prospect for that? And do you have any inkling or instinct in terms of how that conversation might emerge, one that includes the secular side of this country?
That's a great question. I don't see that happening anytime soon between the Christian right and the rest of secular America.
Mm-hmm.
I'm already having nightmares about what that percentage will be of white evangelical support for Trump on election night 2020.
Oh,
and I don't think it's going to be low. I think it's going to be another high number, unless there's some giant scandal between now and then.
Yeah.
And so, and even if not, I mean, it would take a long time for conservative Christianity to sort of earn back some face with the non-Christian culture in the States. However, I find that, so there's like two groups of people that I'm most interested in America right now. One is non-Trump supporting conservatives, because they are forced to explain themselves and they're forced to think
all
about,
the time.
Yeah, right. As I'm sure you've experienced, like, why are you a conservative? Well, you actually have to answer that question. Whereas someone on the Trump train can just go, Trump, get on or get off. They don't actually have to give any arguments. So David Brooks, David Frum, Andrew Sullivan, I'm fascinated by people like that right now.
Sure.
And the other group of people that I'm really interested in is basically the non-white church in America, because they too are sort of in a place where they have to explain themselves. And then what that leads to is some of these beautiful explanations. And so I think if there's going to be a conversation between secular America and Christian America in the next 5 years, I think that conversation is happening with the liberal church. Or even, I think for instance, the black church, which is not socially liberal, but is fairly politically liberal, and at least, repudiated Trump and Roy Moore, for instance, in Alabama. And so I think that they've sort of earned the right to be heard in the eyes of secular America in a way that the right and the white church really have not earned.
Right. Yeah. I have a lot of agreement with that. I think that we're in an interesting time where the left-right divide is not quite as clear cut as it was even 3 or 4 years ago. There's been a lot of splintering and realignment, and a lot of strange alliances and odd bedfellows that have been produced by
somebody's got to write a book, the title of which is Strange Bedfellows.
Yeah, well,
the GOP and the something. Like that book is already being written. Yeah,
I'll brainstorm about it, and I might need a co-author, so I'll call you.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, here's something that perhaps we can end on. I very much enjoy engaging fundamental questions, and I think that part of the reason I was excited to talk to you is because I felt that you'd have a fair amount to say on points like this. I'm I'm going to be honest with you here. And I hope that the audience, yours and mine, won't judge me too harshly, certainly those who are better than I am in this regard. But I'm definitely kind of a bad Christian myself, in the sense that, I'm pretty bad about going to church regularly. I mean, I have in the past. I don't really have a regular church home currently, although it's certainly not something I'm trying to avoid. I just don't happen to have one. And I find I spend a lot of time contemplating the actual teachings of Christ and the Gospels and trying to apply them in my own life and so forth. But I wrestle with doubts on all sorts of details. I oftentimes find that I can share a love of Jesus with a fellow Christian, but I have to be, just like in politics, I sometimes have to be careful about what disagreements or doubts I reveal in the context of a certain conversation. So, I'm pretty orthodox in the sense that I genuinely do believe, and I don't even necessarily know your viewpoints, and I'm not even asking you for literal interpretations of things, but I'm a person who literally believes, or at least I operate on the literal belief, that Jesus died and was raised from the dead.
Yeah.
But I'm not 100% sure that Jonah was really in the belly of a fish for 3 days. I don't know why.
Yeah. I think Jonah certainly was not in the belly of a fish for 3 days.
Okay, but I mean, many Christians do think that he was.
Right.
Yeah. And really, that's not. And if you're a secular person listening to this conversation, you might say, well, both ideas are crazy. So what is the difference exactly?
It's not crazy to think that the Israelites told a story about a prophet going to their worst enemies and being reluctant about it, and God, right? I mean, Jonah not being. Oh, you're saying Jonah and the resurrection. Those are the two ideas.
Right. Yeah. Those are the two ideas. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Like, well, if you're going to believe in one, why not just take it all on board, right? But I have a certain connection to the gospel story, and I've read my Bible cover to cover. So look, I'm not trying to convince anybody one way or the other on that. Sure. The reason I just mentioned that, and I'm a person who believes in the science behind evolution. I'm a person who accepts the Big Bang Theory and so forth. I've got all sorts of quirky ideas and so forth that in different circumstances put me at some odds with some folks, in certain denominations, and, not so much with folks in others. But so maybe it's self-serving for me to always want to be digging towards the fundamental moral truth of the gospel, because, I find that I can tie myself in pretzels thinking about relating the science to the substance of Scripture and contemplating whether or not certain things are literal and metaphorical. And I would love to see a more non-judgmental conversation evolve both within church circles and between the intellectual forces that sort of lead the conversational charge on the left and people who are believers on the right. So, the interactions between people like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and, these different figures who sort of traverse the spectrum in terms of their beliefs in or not in a God. It fascinates me and I think it's positive because it opens up room for productive agreement and disagreement. I just wonder what your advice is to Christians generally as we go out into the world and get to know our fellow Christians, because I feel like, just like with politics, we tend to put on a mask of sorts where we will, we'll chant and cheer and say amen and hallelujah to things that we're all expected to agree with. But I feel like we frequently suppress our doubts, and we frequently suppress our disagreements or potential disagreements in conversation with fellow believers, because we don't want to be ostracized. And me, I wasn't raised Christian, not in any strict sense. So it was easier for me to come to my own opinions about things and to walk into the church from the outside and say, well, these are the conclusions I've come to, and fundamentally I'm
Yeah.
with you guys.
Yeah.
But I look at other Christians who I know have a difficult time summoning the courage to be honest about the things they believe and don't believe, where it seems to run against the mainstream grain. So I'm just wondering what your advice is to us as we engage in conversations between believers that have the potential for, real theological disagreement. How do we have those disagreements and still strive towards the unity, not the uniformity, as you said, but the unity that is called upon to be exhibited within the body of Christ?
Well, you really have brought us full circle to our first couple questions, because I think it's the same fundamental wiring stuff that is active in this area as it is with politics. You say, I want to keep my doubts at bay because if I let my doubts out there, I might be ostracized. But the same thing's happening when you tell your doubts to another Christian. The reason that they want to not hear you is because if they hear you and they agree with you, then they will be ostracized. And if I am a liberal and I'm kind of thinking, well, I kind of like this thing that Trump did, but I don't want to say it because I don't want to be, it's all ostracization. It's all, this is my tribe. This is where I belong. This is my identity. And especially when you get to matters so deep as faith, people's religion, the faith of their families and their best friends, or in their marriages. Now we're getting to essentially the bedrock of human identity. And that will always be difficult and always be uncomfortable to challenge. Now, I was reading a book last night by a non-theistic philosopher, and I read this sentence and I was like, oh man, am I doing what he's accusing Christians of doing? It was still hard. It's still hard for me, right? It's not, that will never go away. It's never going to be easy to just take this criticism of the bedrock of my life, my fundamental convictions, and commit, even more importantly than convictions. So, that's always going to be there. And unfortunately, I think that between the calcification of, let's say, conservative Christianity on the one hand, and the calcification of like pure secularism on the other hand, and I'm taking this again from Daniel Taylor in his book, The Myth of Certainty. Those are both dogmas, and those groups will always have pretty full ranks because you don't have to think very much. And so if you're the kind of person who, either because you are willing to do it or maybe you don't have a choice, ends up thinking through all these hairy questions and asking the tough questions of biblical interpretation, and asking the tough questions of, race or homosexuality or evolution, or if you're going to be one of those people, as long as we're human beings, you're going to have to find that less than half in the middle who will create a space for that. And in one sense, I see that as essentially my life's work is to create that space for people, because I think that the narrowness on either side is almost always wrong, almost by definition.
Yeah.
Anything that is so cognitively convenient to be absolutist, it's too convenient. The chances that that's right are very low. If that's like pure Marxism, or something on the right would be like fundamentalist Mormon polygamy, right? Whatever. Like, there's no way that's true.
Because it caps spiritual and intellectual progression.
It
means you don't have to grow anymore.
Yeah, and it also keeps you from having to make difficult moral choices.
Right.
And that's what joining a cult does too. I mean, you subsume yourself into the cult.
Mm.
And, of course, conservative Christianity is not a cult. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying it's the same stuff. It's the same stuff that we see on Facebook. It's the same stuff that we see when people are yelling past each other, about abortion on either side. We need the courage to be willing to go into no man's land in the middle, and that will require courage on our end. And then it will also require courage from the people who will let us be there and will dialogue with us. And those people are just never going to be the majority. And so my advice is to, number one, acknowledge that it's going to be lonely. I'm sorry. But I exist and you exist, and there are people who are doing it, and there are communities. And then the second one is keep the faith. I mean, be courageous. It's better. It is better to be, I don't know, less accepted, but following a real compass as opposed to a doctored one.
Well, Dan, I think that we can leave it there.
It seems a good place.
Well, I really appreciate you offering your insight, and I appreciate the work that you do. Because even though I agree with you that walking the righteous path or striving to is a lonely walk, and it gets lonelier the better at it you get in some ways. I also think that it bears real fruit, and I think that because of the work that you're doing and others like you, and hopefully I can strive to be one of those others, I think that more people will take up that cross because of what you do than would have otherwise. And I think that perhaps enough people will to make a real difference in our society and in the church and in politics and culture in the years to come. So thank you, Dan. And
thank you. I hope you're right. And I have to say that I'm so interested to see what happens with Better Angels and the work that you guys are doing as well. I mean, I'm already kind of fascinated by just the group session rubric that you guys have developed. I mean, I've been mulling that over for a couple months now, and just kind of continually thinking about how awesome it is and how I might utilize it. So, I mean, thank you for being a fellow traveler on the road.
Yeah, well, indeed. Remarkable things are happening. And I have no doubt that you and I will see each other on that road as we go. So let's do it again, Dan.
Thank you, John.
All right. Thank you. God bless.